So recently I've made a video about annoying things in Google Sheets if you're not advanced user. But in this video, I'm going to talk about annoying things in Google Sheets for advanced users. So the first thing is named ranges. So in Google Sheets, we can name a range. We can either select the range, go to this box and name it by giving this a name, call it sales. I'm actually going to do just this one column in this particular case. Just go here and call it sales. Hit enter, and that's going to name this range. Now, the problem with this is that it doesn't really allow you to do a formula within the range or do open references. So for example, if I just go to named ranges right here, see, this is that range. Let's cancel this and add this one. So this is the range. So one of the good things in Google Sheets is that we can usually do open references. However, if I try to do that open reference here, G2 through G, hit done, it's not going to do that. See, it will hard code the last row in this particular worksheet in the formula. It's also not going to allow me to do some sort of formula here to basically figure out how far that needs to go or something like that. So therefore, you're stuck with this situation if you're going to have this hard-coded ranges. If I just go back to our first one, and I just do my sum of that sales named range. If I add more data to this, it's not going to be included, and every time I have to go and redefine my named range to add those extra rows. Now, the only way to accomplish something similar to just going through the whole data set is to just grab the whole column. So you would do something like from G through G, something like that, hit done, and then I'm naming the whole column, which is not the best option if you have other things happening in the spreadsheet. So without a named range, I could just go here and do sum and do something like this, and then drop the end reference, close parentheses, and that will go all the way down. And now as we add here, it's always going to be included. If I add new rows, it's still going to be a part of it, which kind of renders named ranges useless in a lot of cases. If you can't just select the whole column in your data for some reason because you have some extra things happening, then it's very difficult to actually use them in a meaningful way. And that brings us to the second problem with Google Sheets, is that there's no table objects. So in Excel, you can just define a table object, and then you can refer to that table object using its columns. And then as you add more data to that table, it's automatically going to expand, and it's just going to work out. And while there is this alternating thing that basically just does formatting, alternating colors, you can do that. And as you add more rows to this, you'll see it kind of expands this, but it doesn't work as a table. There's no table name. It's kind of useless. It's just formatting thing. So all of this is kind of in a way related to the next problem, which is the way pivot tables and slicers and data is connected together. So for example, if I go ahead and create a pivot table from this. So again, with a pivot table, the same way we have this problem, we cannot do a range that has an open reference. So I cannot say A1 through G like this. I have to actually have a particular range. So let me just build that pivot table. So now let's say we do our total sales and we break it down by region. So now if we want it, we could add a slicer to this. So I can go under data and create a slicer. And we can select a column for the slicer. I'm just going to go with sales rep. And now this slicer should be connected to this pivot table. So if I go here and select Isabella, see, that should show us Isabella's totals. And if I go back and do select all, hit OK, I'm back to all of these. Now, the way this connection is made is just because these things are located in the same sheet and they are both using the same data source. So that's the way it's making this connection, which It doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, you could add other pivot tables to this, and that pivot table is also going to be connected to the slicer, which means we have this very unusual way of connection. Instead of having names for our pivot tables and connecting slicers to our pivot tables, we just put them on the same worksheet using the same data source, which again is going to create problems because as we add more data to this, we're going to have this problem that we have to go back and redefine the range for our pivot table and then the range for our slicer, which is very annoying. So the only workaround for this is to basically use the whole column instead of using a particular range, because it doesn't allow to do open references here. We cannot just say G like this. If I do that and hit enter, see, it will hard code the last row. So the workaround is to just do the whole column. So I'm going to do from A through G like this. And that should include the entire column from the other spreadsheet. So I'm not basically tied to a particular range. So this trick works on a pivot table. Now, the problem with this particular thing is that if you want this to work, you have to make sure that the first row in your data is your column names. So if you have your data kind of in the middle of the page, you wouldn't be able to do this. But there is another problem here. So I cannot do that same trick on the slicer. So if I now try to assign that same range and do from A through G for the slicer and try to hit enter to apply, you'll see it will still hard code this range size. So that makes the slicer very difficult to work with if you're working with dynamic data and you add more data to your reports. Now with pivot table, you can deal with this blanks. You could simply go and add a filter and use that same, for example, region column here and simply just say, add a condition and say is not empty. So that way you can clear this empty zeros out of here. And that way your pivot table will update. But with slicers, we're kind of stuck. So the next in the list is going to be sum ifs and index functions and how they don't allow arrays. Google Sheets is very good at copying annoying things from Excel. So in Excel, if you use sum ifs, you cannot use arrays, and that's the same thing that's happening in Google Sheets. So let me do an example of that. So if I wanted to select these 3 rows, do a semicolon and then do the last 3 rows, curly bracket closed, hit enter, that should give me all those sales that I selected, the first 3 and last 3, right? And then let's say I'm gonna do another one for regions. So I'll take the first 3, semicolon, last 3. So 2 arrays. So now if I do some sort of sum ifs, I can go ahead as a sum range and select these numbers, comma, and then select this criteria range, comma, and then let's say I want to get the total for West region, like this. So as you can see, this works. We get our total just fine, no problem. However, if we try to replace now these ranges with a formula that will basically give you that same result. So if I go here and copy this array without the equal sign, hit escape, go back to this and select this and replace it with that formula, right? I hit enter, and as you can see, it still works. So you can use arrays for criteria range. However, for the sum range, it's not gonna work. So if I go here, copy this, hit escape, go back, and basically just replace this with that formula, hit enter, now I get an error because it requires this to be a range. That absolutely makes no sense to me. So that's the same for sum ifs, average ifs. And that brings me to index function, which is in a way more annoying than sum ifs because Excel actually allows you to do arrays in index function and Google Sheet does not. So let's say you're trying to create some sort of index match formula to do something like a VLOOKUP, right? to demonstrate this, I need some sort of lookup table. So let's just make something up. So here we go. We have this rates for commissions. We'd like to add them to this table. So I'm going to go ahead and do my commission rate. And if I wanted to do my index match, well, first of all, I would do index. And then I can basically grab the column where I need the data from, comma. And then I'm going to do match function. And I'm going to refer to this person's name, comma. And then we're going to refer to this list of people, comma 0 for exact match, close parentheses, and close parentheses again. I am going to make this an absolute reference and this absolute reference too. So if you don't know how index and match works, I have separate video covering this in detail. You can watch that to see how this works. Now, if I just simply drag this formula down like this, see, we get our rates. So for each person, we pull their matching commission rate. Now, the issue with this is not an array formula. This is just a formula we basically just drag down. So if I try to convert this to an array formula, and I go here, and instead of the C2, I just do this whole column of sales reps and try to do Control-Shift-Enter. I hit Enter. It's still not going to do array formula. See, it's suggesting me to just drag the formula down. So as an array, this doesn't work. This would have worked in Excel. With this, we're stuck with just using VLOOKUPs every time we want to do some sort of array formula. So this brings me to the next issue with Google Sheets, where it gets really, really slow. And one of the reasons is because it's not very smart about dealing with formulas. So what I mean by that is, in Excel, one thing that I've noticed is that if you create a function and you refer to the whole column like this to sum a column, in Excel, in a regular spreadsheet today, you would have over 1 million rows. Now you have all the blanks below. So I did a lot of testing in Excel to see what happens if you select the whole column versus just selecting the range. And I found that it doesn't really make it slower if you actually select the whole column unless you have more data someplace else in the column, because Excel figures out that your used range goes until a certain point, and it doesn't actually keep going in the function and looking through every single row, even though you have them selected. So in Google Sheets, what you find out is that if you refer to a whole column or you have an open reference, Google Sheets will actually get really, really slow. So if you do an array formula, for example, to populate a range of values, let's say we do this names. Let's move this to the side so I can show you an example of this. So if you do an array formula in Google Sheets, where you basically give this the whole column here as a lookup value, then you do your table array, which it could be this, or you can do open references or that too. And then I can do second column as the commission rate and 0 for exact match. Then I'm going to do Control-Shift-Enter to convert this to an array formula and hit Enter. And what happens as we do this, if you have a lot of empty rows here, your spreadsheets are going to get very, very slow, even if your data is not very large. So very often you can find that you can speed up your spreadsheet by simply just deleting some empty rows below here. And you'll find out that if you have a lot of empty rows and you delete them, it will make these calculations a lot faster, which means it's pretty much just going through every single row in your data to figure out what to do. Now, the next one in my list is something that's directly tied to the previous problem, the problem of getting very slow spreadsheets. And as your spreadsheets get more complicated and they get really slow, there is no option to switch it to manual calculation. So every time you do a change, if it takes 30 seconds to recalculate something, you cannot turn it off and just do manual calculation. So if you go to File and go to Spreadsheet Settings, under Calculation, there is no way to change it to manual calculation. So the next in my list is going to be the fact that there's no Evaluate shortcut. We cannot select a part of the formula and evaluate it to see what the output is. Well, I guess it's not true to say there isn't. It just only works if your output is a single value. However, it doesn't work if your output is an array. So to demonstrate an example of this, let me just go back to that index match. So let's just demonstrate the part that actually works first. So if I go here and I have this index match function, so what you could do, you could just highlight this inner match function. And when you highlight that, and what you'll see in my case, I get this question mark. That means that evaluate functionality that actually exists in Google Sheets is not turned on. So you can do F9 to turn it on. And you can see as I select this match function, it gives me 1. So that means the output of this match function, the final result of that match function is actually 1. And that's because it was able to find Isabella in the first position in this list. Now, if I go to the next line over here, well, let's actually go to this line, for example, for Jake. And I select that same match function. So see, it says 6. So basically, it says Jake is number 6 in this particular list. So if your function actually outputs one value, it will actually display what that value is. The problem is, it doesn't display it for an array. It also doesn't display if the function gives you an error. So for example, if I go back and update this function to, let's say we made a mistake here, we have an extra comma 0 in this formula. And then we drag this formula down, right? Now, if I go back and try to evaluate that inner match function and select this part, it doesn't give you like it's an error or anything like that. You just simply get no results in this error case. Now, if you pay attention, there's this little tiny red over here that highlights that there's an error in our formula syntax. And if I rolled over it, it will give me an error of some sort. So it's kind of helpful. But if you try to do this with an array formula, it will never evaluate to anything. Like if you're used to Excel's F9 key, it has its own problems in Excel, but at least it gives you the array output in some ways so you can understand what's happening. Here, you will have to copy that part of a formula and do it separately to see what the output is. So the next problem in Google Sheets I'm going to go over is import range formula. I probably find this problem to be one of the most annoying problems in Google Sheets. And there are a few different problems with import range. Let's talk about the first one. So if I'm trying to grab some data from this spreadsheet to my other spreadsheet, let's say here, if I do equals import range, I'm going to provide that URL in quotes. And then we're going to refer to the range from that worksheet from here. So that's sales data worksheet from A through G. Exclamation sign and A through G. If I hit enter, what's going to happen, because I'm trying to access another worksheet, it's going to ask me to give access to that other worksheet, which is fine. So I'm going to click allow access. Now the problem with this is that once you allow access to a worksheet, there's no way to go back and revoke this access to that worksheet. So if I at some point decided I don't want this worksheet to have access to the other spreadsheet that I just did, there's no way for me to do that without deleting this worksheet and making another one. And if somebody knows of a way of doing this, please let me know. I have not been able to find any way to do this. Now, the second problem is that you have a limit. So if you decide to import data from a lot of different spreadsheets, there is a limit of how many you can do. According to their documentation, you can only do import ranges from 50 different spreadsheets. So if you decide you want to break something down to, let's say, 200 different files and then bring that data in, it's not going to let you do that. Then you're stuck with doing some crazy workarounds to make it happen. And that also brings to the next problem with the import range is the array size. So when you import data from another spreadsheet, it will work until your data grows too large for it to import. And then you're going to start having errors. And the most annoying thing with this problem is that nowhere in the documentation I can find what that size is. And it seems like that size is not a particular cell count or row count limitation. It's probably more like related to how many bytes you have in your data. I've tried to run some tests, and sometimes I'm able to, let's say, get 30,000 rows, and other times 40,000 rows, and then sometimes it can get to 80,000 rows. So I did all kinds of tests with different size of columns, different types of rows to figure out what it is, and I find that it's different every time. So the only assumption I can make for that is that this is tied to how many bytes of data you're importing, and if it grows over a certain byte size, then it will stop the import. So if you have large text fields and things like that, that number is likely to be smaller. And if you have smaller fields, that number is likely to be larger, which basically makes it impossible to estimate what size you could do to not have any issues. So the next one in my list is going to be tied to scripts. So one of the most annoying things I find with scripts is when you create a custom function. When you pass an argument in this function and it's one of your cells, so let's say I want to just get X and Y. Now the problem with this is that when you go to the spreadsheet and use this function, when you get information from Google Sheets, from these functions, like this, and you point to a cell or a range, the value you get is not a range reference, it's just the value of that cell. So if I try to create a custom function to do something with the color of the cell or formatting of the cell or really any other property of that cell, I cannot do it because the only thing I can get from that cell is the value of the cell here, which is very limiting for types of functions you can create. And that's the same if you do a cell, one single reference, or a range reference, same problem. So the next one in my list is creating triggers. So if I go to triggers and try to create a trigger, so this is where we can schedule something to run at certain time on a certain day. So if I go here and switch this to time driven, and then switch this to one of the options. So for example, if I do hour timer, I can have this run every hour, every 2 hours, every 4 hours. But let's say I want this to run every hour from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then for the rest of the day, I don't want this to run. So unfortunately, there's no option like that. So the same way, if I try to do daily trigger, if I wanted this to run Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, there is no way to do that. So what we'll end up doing instead, we would have to just do week timer and then choose for one of the days, set it up, and then the next day, set it up. So we have to do a bunch of separate triggers, which is very difficult then to actually manage once you have all these triggers. And this can get very complicated when we're working with like hourly triggers and things like that. So if I'm going to do hourly trigger 5 hours of the day and the rest of the day, I don't want this to run, well, I need to set up 5 different triggers for every day that I need this to run. So if I want this to run 7 days and each day is going to have 5 of this, I end up with 35 triggers set up here. Very difficult to create, very difficult to manage. Now you could write a script to create a trigger, but again, managing that is not easy. So there are a lot of other things that we can talk about. There's like script execution time. So if your script runs over that limit, it's going to stop running the script. So you have to find all kinds of workarounds. But that's pretty much my top 10. So let me know if you agree with this top 10, or maybe you have some other things that I've missed here. And that should do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.